Once you get comfortable working with JDBC, oftentimes larger applications, or once applications that just want to write less database code, they're going to move to an object-oriented relational database framework called Hibernate. It's an ORM. And what Hibernate does is it seeks to make the transition from a database to objects easier. Because if you've noticed with JDBC, for every single time you want to go to the database, you have to translate your relational database, these result sets, into the objects that you want to work with. And in Java, this is called an impedance mismatch, because we're having to translate from one object to another. And even though we're not writing the same code, the exact same code for every table, we're still doing the same thing every table, every time we want to go to the database, and we're repeating ourselves. And as we know, that's not dry, and that's not something that we want to do. So we'll use the ORM framework named Hibernate. And let me show you an example. We've got a transition here from JDBC to Hibernate. In fact, it is in the example app that we've been working with. In fact, we can say it's on the Hibernate branch. So if we say git checkout Hibernate, import our changes. Okay, great. Now we're ready to go. Let me show you what's so neat about Hibernate is that we can take our object and we can put annotations on it. We can apply metadata to this object that links it with the table. So we say this class corresponds with the table stops. And let me show you the table stops. If we say Sql Lite 3, here's the table stops, here's some of the columns. We can see that the primary key, we give a way to generate the ID, we give the column the stop ID, we can give a couple attributes about it, and then we can just specify each column. And now when we want to pull this object from the database, we simply say, put in a line like this, hey, why don't you give me a list? Well, first of all, I'm going to create criteria for all the stop objects. And then I say, why don't you just go ahead and give me a list? List all of those out. And also notice, all of this has to happen inside a transaction, inside a database transaction. And that's one of the core tenets of Hibernate, is that you want to do all your work inside of a transaction. So here we're manually applying the transaction. Later on, we can also annotate this class with @transactional, and we can get rid of, we can get rid of those, and those will be just placed there automatically. But for now, let's apply the transaction manually. And it's really nice. We can add additional criteria on to, we can say criteria.add restrictions.equal stop name. It gives us the ability to work with our database in the object-oriented fashion instead of having to write where statements and write select statements and updates. It gives us that ability to operate with very naturally. So in order to get to this point, there's a couple of things that you need to do. First of all, it is a bit tricky integrating Hibernate with SQL Lite. You have to create this class called SQL Lite dialect, place it in the org.hibernate.dialect package. This is essentially a custom class that someone open sourced. It's not provided by the Hibernate community themselves. Also note, in the application context, we've created a few new things. We now have the session factory, and inside the session factory, we define a few properties for Hibernate, like what dialect of SQL that's going to be speaking, We also list all of our annotated classes, which is stop, this guy, as well as the data source. The data source is very simple. It is just the stuff that we had listed out in our JDBC data source earlier. And let me do a comparison so you can see. Go to local history. You can see how much fewer code it is to use Hibernate. How much fewer lines of code it is to use Hibernate as opposed to JDBC. And you can see that we're just taking this connection information, these guys right here, and we're putting them into the spring.xml. We're putting them into the configuration so they don't have to be in the code anymore. Then you'll also need a few new libraries in your pom.xml. It was a bit tricky integrating it because we need to use Hibernate Framework 4.0, and they've introduced a lot of changes, but we have to use Hibernate 4.0 in order to work with SQL dialect that we downloaded from GitHub. So I recommend 4.0, annotations 3.56. In 4.0 they actually have a new way to annotate your tables instead of using @entity. But we're just going to go with the old way. This way may in fact be deprecated. But one very, very important thing to note is that there's actually an @entity for Hibernate as well, and you want to use the JavaX persistence @entity. You'll see that there's two of them. The JavaX persistence defines a common standard that any ORM for Java can use. And there's other frameworks just like Java that can use JavaX persistence, and it lets you switch in between them. You're going to have a lot of trouble in your code if you run org.hibernate.annotations.entity. You want to use the JavaX persistence entity. So be wary of that. Be sure to keep an eye on that. In fact, just go ahead and add this line into your wherever you're working with those annotations. Just add this line, it will import all the stuff that you need.